Good day, everyone, and welcome to the One Open Door podcast. My name is David McKay. This is a place for talks and conversations about Zen awareness practice and about how to live that practice right here, right now, in this very world we live in. I hope you enjoy the experience. If you are someone who would like to receive support for your own practice through the Sangha that I facilitate, then I would encourage you to go to www.theoneopendoor.org and see what's available. We've got virtual meditation and discussion groups happening twice a week on Thursday and Sunday evenings Eastern Time. We have a meditation happening in the mornings at a couple different times now, plus workshops, classes, retreats, stuff like that, practice days. And so check it out. And if you would like to join in and see if the Sangha could be a home for your own practice and a place where you can grow your practice, then let me know. There's a contact form on the website you can use, or you can just send me an email, djmckay429@gmail.com. All right, on to the podcast. So I have a question for you to start off with. See what you think of this. Is thinking useful? Now, of course, at first glance, that seems like kind of a ridiculous question because, of course it's useful. If it weren't useful, we wouldn't be equipped with the capacity to think. And yet, to me, see what you think of this. When we look at the state of humanity and the chaos and disharmony that's happening in the human family, that question becomes relevant, I think, and here's why. So if you look at, for example, the state of an individual heart and mind, by and large, there's a lot of suffering going on there. There's self-judgment happening. There are beatings happening all the time. A person is in a conversation about whether or not they're a good person or a bad person. They're trying to meet standards and expectations and failing. All that kind of stuff that we talk about all the time in practice. And then if you look at the relationship between people, say between individuals, the same kind of stuff is going on there. People, by and large, are engaged in, not completely, of course, what I'm about to say. There are lots of instances of goodness and harmony happening, but by and large, that's not what's going on from what I can see. What's happening between people is, at the very least, a kind of dissembling that's going on, a kind of pretending. I'm pretending to be somebody I'm not, and so are you. And our relationship consists in you being somebody you're not, and I'm being somebody I'm not, and sort of agreeing to support each other in that. More kind of difficult and subtle are the ways in which people, actually not so subtle, oftentimes, the way in which people are actually doing hurtful things towards each other. Aggressive and passive-aggressive communication, not to mention, abuse, emotional abuse, physical abuse, and all that kind of stuff that happens between people. And then if you look at humanity at large, of course, then it gets really obvious that things are not going well for humanity. The prejudice, the unfairness, the injustice that's happening, and all the individual forms of that that we hear in the news all the time. Just the awful ways that people treat each other, the ways people are subjugated, the ways that people are used. Some people are used by other people, or some people are scapegoated by other people. All of that kind of stuff. So, and that's clear to everyone listening, I'm sure. It's obvious that we are in big trouble and things are not going well as a human family, or it seems obvious to me anyway. And so if you look at that, say, well, what is the cause of that? Well, one way to talk about the cause of all the chaos that's going on is thinking. And on each of those levels, to me, on each of those levels, individual, interpersonal, communal, you could say, the cause of all the chaos and disharmony and just the ugliness that is being, perpetuated out there is thinking. People are thinking themselves into those places. So, for example, let's take something like racial prejudice. Well, what is racial prejudice? It's a pattern of thinking. That's all it is. It's thoughts. And people believe in the reality of those thoughts. And because they believe in the reality of those thoughts, they don't question the place they're coming from. They don't see the injustice and unfairness and just downright ugliness in racial prejudice. And as a result, immense amount of suffering happens as a result of that thinking pattern that we call racial prejudice. And that's going on everywhere all the time. Within an individual person, it's the same thing. As I was saying before, there's, I have, what is this thing that says I'm not the right person, I'm not a good enough person? Well, all that is thought. That is a thought pattern that I believe, that I was, taught to believe as a kid, and I'm thinking that. I'm to say it a different way, I'm telling myself that over and over again, and so it becomes real to me. And the suffering involved in that is immense. The number of people in this world who believe that they are not the person they should be, there's something wrong with them, all of that. I mean, it's almost universal from what I can see. And of course, it's so deeply thought, so deeply believed. Belief is basically just a collection of thoughts that are unquestioned. So deeply thought and believed that a lot of people don't even know that's going on. They have no idea they're believing that. That's how deep it goes. And so it's all thought. It's all thinking. Thinking is you could say, from a certain point of view, you could say thinking is the cause of all of our problems. And so if we ask the question, is thinking useful, with the implication, what we're really asking is, does thinking result in good things? Does it result in harmony, peace? Does it, things that are good and effective, good solutions to problems, all that kind of stuff? Then I think we'd have to say, kind of no. Thinking is not being very useful to us because it is causing all kinds of stuff going on. Now, of course, there is a lot of thinking that is extremely useful and it's happening, but we'll get to that in a minute. But just in general, just if you look at the general state of humanity, thinking doesn't seem to be terribly useful on that level. Useful in the sense of creating happiness for human beings. But of course, if we look at that a little bit more closely, then we have to see, well, the problem is not thinking. The problem is how we're thinking, or even better, I think, is the place we're thinking from. The problem, the reason we are in the mess that we're in as human beings is the place we're thinking from, not thinking itself. Because thinking is useful, of course. Thinking produces all kinds of good stuff in our lives, and has the potential to dramatically improve our lives in all kinds of different ways, and has for eons. And yet, there's this other kind of thinking. So that's just practical, direct thinking. There's this other kind of thinking that is on top of that is creating a context in which we cannot be happy with what we have and with what our natural ability to think produces. And so what I want to do in this podcast is I want to explore that. I want to explore what is thinking that is useful, that produces harmony, peace, joy, goodness, cooperation between people, and good solutions to problems, and also good relationships between people, and also a good relationship between people in the world that we live in. And what is the sort of thinking that does not, that produces disharmony and all the ugliness that I was talking about? Okay, very good. So I think to begin with that, the first thing we need to do is decide, what do we mean by that word thinking? So let's explore that just a little bit. I think typically what that word means is this. It's a series of concepts that are strung together that are guided by this thing that we call reason, which I'll talk about more in a bit, and that towards a particular conclusion. Okay? So, in other words, we have this ability to abstract from our experience. Our experience in itself, see if you agree with this, see if this is your experience, our experience in itself is not conceptual. It is not abstract. It's mental in a sense, just because it's we're aware of it. It's happening in our mind. Our mind is operating. It's functioning when we are experiencing. But it's not conceptual. It's not abstract. And there's no language in it within our pure experience. What thinking is and does is take our experience and abstract it and put it into concepts, of course. So for example, I mean, this is obvious, but I'll say it anyway. I'm outside right now, and I'm looking at this object. There's a very large object in front of me, and it's extremely complex. It's got all kinds of different colors in it, textures, and it's big, and just to have the pure experience of it, all of that comes into my mind at the same time, and I experience all those aspects of it, and there's differentiation in there. But I'm not differentiating it conceptually. But when I start thinking, I do. So I look at that thing and I call it a tree. So that's a tree. It's like, well, and those are the leaves, and that's a limb, and that's the trunk, or whatever. So I've taken that object and I have broken it down into pieces. Or I might look at, here's another thing that's within my awareness is there's a pile of firewood over there. Well, if I'm not perceiving that conceptually, if I'm not putting concepts on that, it's this, I know what it is, but it is without idea. It's just, again, it's this collection of perceptions, really. And there's all this variety, and it is gorgeous, too. I'm looking at it, and it's absolutely gorgeous. It rained recently, and there's water on there's a piece of tin on the top, and there's water on that, and there's rocks holding it down, and the whole thing is it's gorgeous. And I can have a direct experience of that. And again, I know what that is, but I know it without knowing it. I know it without conceptualizing it. I don't need to conceptualize that to know what that stuff is over there and how it's useful. But I can conceptualize it. And that's really useful. Because then I can think to myself, I'm getting low on firewood, which I'm not. Actually, I've got a big pile. But if I were, I can think to myself, I need more firewood. I'm going to go over to my friend Kathleen's house. She lives on this property, and there's lots of trees that are down, and I can cut up the trees and make more firewood. And so I can think that to myself, and I can make a plan for getting more firewood, which I couldn't do if I couldn't conceptualize. I don't think. If I couldn't conceptualize that, I wouldn't be able to predict something in the future. And that's what's useful about our thinking. Or here's another example. This is my favorite example. It's the one I always use, and this comes from way back in my life when I was an anthropology major at college. And it just I don't know to what extent I really got this at the time, but anyway, it's when I think back on that now, it really is interesting in terms of the mind and thinking and how the mind works. So there's this group of Native American people, and I can't remember where they were, somewhere in the East Coast, I think. And here's what they did. Each family would make a net and maintain a net. And I think it was made out of hair, maybe even their hair, believe it or not. Just really extraordinary, just kind of amazing. And this net was very short. It was only like a foot high, maybe a foot and a half high, but long. Like each family's net was, I don't know how long, like say 20 feet long, 20 or 30 feet long. And it was a part of the responsibility within the community to maintain these nets. And so each family had their own. And then occasionally the families would get together, and the nets, they would string them together, and they would attach the nets together. And so they would take these individual nets and make one long net in this big semicircle. And some of the people would hold up the nets, and then the other people would go and beat the bushes and drive the rabbits out of the bushes into the nets. And then they would have lunch. Right? And so, you think about that. It's like, that's an incredibly complex thing to arrange. And of course, that's very simple compared to a lot of the stuff that is happening in our society these days. I mean, it's astronomically more complex than that. But even that's a very complex thing to accomplish. And that can't be done without concepts. You have to have an idea of something, and and that's what, again, is what's useful about thinking, is you can abstract, and then you can put the ideas together and compare and contrast and string them together, use our reason to reach these conclusions. And so I can imagine that because I have the thinking capacity. I can imagine that. I can put it in concepts and string it together, and then I can communicate it to you. I can say, hey, I'll make a net with my family. You make a net with your family. We'll stick it together. We'll drive the rabbits out. It's going to be great. And so then, there's this highly adaptive strategy that we've developed that comes out of our capacity to think. Okay, so I think that's probably pretty clear and obvious. And so, let me ask you this now. Is that all there is? Is that all there is going on in our mind? Is this kind of logical, reasonable progression of ideas and concepts in language? The answer, of course, is no. There's much more to the mind than that. Although, I don't know how often people experience what is outside of conceptual thinking. I mean, in a way, people are experiencing it all the time, I think, without acknowledging it to themselves. But by and large, people are within, this is my experience anyway. Let me just going into my past and my experience. Before I started doing practice, and for a long time after I started doing practice, and even now sometimes, there's a tendency to get lost in thought. And so instead of relating to the thing, so here's the tree or the firewood, instead of relating directly to that and to the experience of that I'm having, I'm relating to my ideas of that. And you see that happen all the time. So, like, here's another one. Like, my friend Bob, let's say Billy Bob. My friend Billy Bob. Billy Bob, is infinitely complex as an entity. And just even one moment to the next, he's constantly changing. The way that he looks is changing. What's going on inside of him is changing. It's a progression through time, and there's no fixed thing, really, that is Bob. But I will take my friend Bob, Billy Bob, let's say, and I'll take Billy Bob, and I will make a concept out of him. And I say, well, it's Billy Bob. And Billy Bob is this, that, or the other thing. And now I know Billy Bob, I know who he is. But I don't really, right? Because Billy Bob is not the same person one moment to the next. But I just assume that he is, and I call him this concept, and that becomes fixed in time. But that life is not like that. Life is not fixed in time. But that tends to be the way that we're conditioned, I would say, to relate to things. I'm going to relate to my idea of the thing, or my concept of the thing, instead of the thing itself. Okay? And the problem with that, of course, is that we get trapped inside of our ideas of things, and we stop directly perceiving what's here. And that is a big problem, because what's here is life, joy, goodness, happiness, harmony, satisfaction, plus everything that we need. The experience of being here is the experience of being alive, of being connected. And if we're trapped in a world of ideas and concepts, then we are disconnected from that, and we have artificially, unnecessarily divorced ourselves from the source of all goodness, love, joy, and everything is that we want in our hearts. That's the problem with getting stuck in thinking. So anyway, from what I can see, and this is certainly my own experience, we have this tendency to get stuck in our thinking and not experiencing. But that's all that's there. So, see if you have this experience, and if you want, it could be fun to, after I describe this, to stop and just play around this, stop the recording, and play around this for a moment, and just have the experience I want to describe. So, do you know the experience where you're just being? You're just here, without thinking. Maybe if you feel like it, stop the recording for a second and just sit and be. and see if you can see the place, experience the place of just being without thinking. It's really lovely, isn't it? And difficult to accomplish because the tendency to think is so pervasive and powerful. And we've been practicing it since we were little kids, practicing the capacity to think. And we've been conditioned, and I'll talk more about this in a bit, but we've been conditioned to live in the world of thought. And so it's really difficult to just be. And yet that can be done. And I would say that's our natural state, actually, just to be here in this moment without thinking. So that's one possible experience, just to be and just experience. And so, like, here I am sitting, and there's a tree in the firewood, but there's all kinds of stuff. There's flowers around. There actually, interestingly, is a little rabbit hopping around. She must have heard what I said. I was trying to remind, rabbits are okay. Anyway, there's the little dwelling that I live in. Different kind of things, and I can sit here, and I can experience that without needing to conceptualize it. I can just directly experience it without having words to describe it, without telling myself what it is. So that's one possible experience. Here's another one that is a bit easier to attain, which is I'm here and I am present with all of these things, and I am aware of conditioned mind, naming everything and conceptualizing it. Do you know that one? So you might try, if you feel like it, try pausing the recording and see if you can have that experience too, where you're here, you're present, you're still directly experiencing things, but conditioned mind is, I'm not even going to call that conditioned mind. The mind, the thinking mind is naming things and attempting to conceptualize them as we have the capacity to do. So try that out for a second. Okay, so in that case, we're still here, still in our awareness, and the mind is kind of following our perceptions around naming things, and that's what it tends to do. And on that level, there's not particularly a problem with that. That's why I decided not to call that conditioned mind, because there's not particularly a problem with that. That's what the mind does. It is, as I was saying before, has a tendency to conceptualize experience because that is potentially useful. But the trick in practice, of course, is to stay present and aware that that's happening and not get lost lose the awareness in the thinking, because then the thinking becomes autonomous, and then we start thinking all kinds of crazy things that are not here, that's the conditioned mind part that I'll talk about more in a minute. Okay, so we have the capacity to be present and aware without thought. And then we have the capacity to think, and we have the capacity to become lost in our thinking. Actually, let me go ahead and I'm going to go down that road for a second about being lost in thinking. What happens there? Well, to be lost in thinking is what I was just talking about. I've lost awareness. I have stepped out of the place of awareness and presence, and now I am in the world of concepts, as if the concepts are reality. And I am going, from concept to concept to concept, relating to that instead of to my direct experience. Okay? Now, the problem with that, of course, is, one problem, as I was saying before, is now I've lost access to my direct experience, and everything that I want and need from my heart in life is in my direct experience. So I've lost access to that. That's bad enough. And the other problem is that I have this programming that I've received a long time ago that is steering all of this thinking into negative, self-destructive places, and all the places I referred to earlier, the chaos and prejudice and injustice and all that stuff that's happening between people and within the mind of each individual person, almost every individual person within our human family. And so, when we were all kids, what happened was, we have this natural ability to conceptualize, and there were concepts that were implanted in our minds, not from our direct experience, but from, we were forced to take on these concepts through our society. Our society required us to accept certain things as true. And these concepts are stuck in there as if they are our direct experience, but they're not. So, for example, most of us were taught that we're not the right person in some way. We're not okay. There's something wrong with us. Well, that's absolutely not true. There's nothing that's not wrong with anybody. That's just ridiculous. It's silly. How could that be? I'm just who I am. How could there be something wrong with me? But we're all taught to believe that that's true. And so that concept becomes as if reality to me. So I've got the firewood, I've got the tree, and I've got myself, and there's something wrong with me. All those things seem like they are representations of experience, but they're not. The tree and the firewood are, but the other one isn't. The other one's made up. It has never been my experience that there's something wrong with me, because there's no such thing as something wrong with me. That in itself is a concept that is illusory and empty of any reality. It cannot be so. And so, but we're programmed to take that stuff on and believe in it. And so when we get lost in thought, we're not just thinking, a lot of the thinking is about the tree and the firewood, the equivalent, or the car, or this stuff. Like later on today, I'm going to go run some errands. So if I was to lose awareness, I could go into my mind and start thinking about all the errands I'm going to do. I'm going to do this or that and that, and then we're going to do this. And so there's that kind of thinking. But then there's this other kind of conditioned thinking, where that's getting steered inevitably into these assumptions that we're taught to take on, that we're not okay, there's something wrong with me. Or, same thing really, the world is not okay, you're not okay, there's something wrong with you. And from that comes all of the chaos and unhappiness and dysfunction and violence and cruelty and all that kind of stuff that happens in our human world. Okay, so I'm not going to say anything more about that right now, because I think that's probably pretty clear. I mean, there's all kinds of intricacies we could go into about that and how all that happens, but that's not the point of this podcast. So, but anyway, so that's what happens if we lose ourselves in thought. So let me come back to, so that's unconscious thinking, let's call it. It's unconscious in the sense that I'm not conscious. It's happening automatically. It's pre-programmed. The associations that are happening between the concepts in my mind are all pre-programmed, and they're pre-programmed to produce a certain result, which is I'm living in a world where I'm suffering and I'm not the right person. That's basically what conditioned mind does. So, but what does conscious thinking look like? What is that? So try this on for size. We tend to imagine, I think, that the thinking, when we are thinking, how to say this, the primary thing that's happening there is we are associating concepts and sticking them together, like I was saying before, and reaching conclusions. But to me, that's actually not what's happening. What's happening is that the thinking, the concepts are not first, the experience is first. So the thinking is following along our experience and describing it. And particularly, it's following along the insights we have and are describing the insights after we have had the insights. So it's not causing the insights, it's describing them. So let me see if I can. So this gets kind of subtle. So let me see if I can explain that better. So try this on for size. I'm going to ask you another question, and you know the answer to this question already. But watch how you know the answer. Okay, what happens in your mind? Okay, you ready? What's 2 plus 2? Did you see how that happened? Answer, of course, is 4. But how do you know? Did anything happen? Was there any kind of logical progression that happened in your mind to produce that answer? No. At least that's my experience. None at all. It just appears. Isn't that what happened? Didn't it just appear in your mind? 2 plus 2 is 4. That's an insight. And it's an insight that has come from your experience. At some point you were taught that 2 plus 2 is 4. But that's more than just conceptual. You have an experience of it. If you put two things to get two rocks with 2 more rocks, now you have 4 rocks. Okay? And so there's an experience there. That is in your mind. And so that just occurs to you. It just appears out of nowhere. That's an insight. Okay, here's another example of the same thing. This one actually might be a little bit easier and clearer. So I'm going to ask you another question. So watch what your mind does when I ask you the question. What did you have for breakfast? Did you see what happened? Did you actually have to think to know what you had for breakfast? No. It just showed up in your mind, right? It showed up as an insight. Now, immediately afterwards, you probably told yourself what you had for breakfast. I had, eggs and toast or whatever. But before that, now again, this is just my experience, see what your experience is. But before that, you just saw that. It appeared in your mind. You had an insight. Okay? So there's a difference between thinking and seeing. Mostly what's happening actually is we're seeing when we're in a conscious place, not when we're in that unconscious conditioned mind place. There's no seeing happening at all. We're divorced from seeing. We're divorced from our awareness. We're stuck in concepts. But if we're present and aware, mostly what's happening is we're seeing. Now, we might take what we see and conceptualize it because that's useful. But the first thing that's happening is we're seeing. And so, okay, so let me take a slightly more complex example. So like I said, I'm going to go a little bit later today and run some errands in town. And let's say I want to think about, I want to decide what time do I need to leave to get everything done in the time that I have. Okay? So I'm going to do a thinking process about that. So what I want to explore is, what is that process actually? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, I'm going to ask myself, what are the things that I need to do in town? Okay? So I'm going to ask myself, and then information shows up. Well, how does it show up? Does it show up actually, so here's another way of saying what I'm trying to convey here. Does it show up actually as an act of the will on my part? Or does it just show up on its own? Well, in my experience, it just shows up on its own. So, I'm going to go to the laundromat, but that just shows up. It's like, it's there. And then I say to myself, I need to do laundry. And it's funny because this is happening right now as I'm describing it. I got to go to the lumber yard. But that just shows up. And then there's the grocery store. And then, what do I need at the grocery store? Well, that just shows up. It shows up in my mind. So those are, basically what I'm doing is I'm directing my attention in a certain way towards the afternoon and towards this plan that I have to go and do errands. And as I turn my attention in that way, the information that I need shows up in my mind as a series of insights. It's kind of like the same way it works with sight physically. So I'm sitting here in this chair outside. And so now I'm going to look to the left. And I see, there's a turkey. Oh my God. I just turned to the left and there's a turkey in the yard walking around. That is cool. It's really beautiful. Wow. Huh. That's interesting. So anyway, so there's the turkey. And then I'm going to slowly turn my attention to the right. And so the turkey is leaving my perception. I can no longer see it. Now I see there's this pink flowered bush. I don't know what kind of bush it is. And then there's this big cypress thing, and then there's the little dwelling I live in, and so on. So as I'm turning my gaze to the right, it is producing different perceptions. So the same thing that happens with thinking. So I'm going to turn my attention to the afternoon, and as I do, it's like it's the perception is automatically coming in about, there's this and that and that and that and that and that. Now in that case, I'm talking about the future, and so who knows what will actually happen? Probably nothing the way that I actually imagine it. But in terms of the thinking process that I'm doing, it just appears of its own. And that's what thinking is. That's what conscious thinking is. It's actually seeing. So I'm looking towards the afternoon. So a little while ago, the turkey has now disappeared behind the berry bushes. I can't see it anymore. But a minute ago, I looked over there, and I saw the turkey, and there was no thinking required. Now, I called it a turkey in order to be able to describe it to you, but in the direct apprehension of that, there's no concepts. It's just, oh, wow. That's seeing. And the same thing happens that in general, if we're present, we're going and we're seeing stuff. And then, we conceptualize it so we can communicate it to ourselves, so we can remember it. Like I'm going to the grocery store. I actually have a little, app on my phone I use. Whenever I have an insight, it's like, oh, I need olive oil. I put that in the app because I actually can't trust my mind to produce all the information that I need while I'm there, because the insights have happened, over time about what I need. So I have this little app that I plug all that into, and when I go to the store, I look at the app, and so there my insights are recorded. Oh, I need olive oil, and I need some of this and some of that, and like that. But it all happens. Oh, there's turkeys back, eating the berries now, huh? But anyway, so that's the process of thinking. It's actually seeing when it's a conscious process. And as I said, we can conceptualize it if that's useful. So in this case, for example, I can conceptualize it by, I'm going to make a plan. Because I look to see, well, what makes sense to do first? Well, this and that. So I'm going to go there. I'm going to go to the lumber yard first because that's on the way, and then I'm going to go to the laundry, whatever it might be. Sorry, I'm having a whole experience with this turkey. I don't know if you can hear it. Can you hear it? It just ran in front of me, like 15 feet away. Huh, sorry about that. So anyway, so I can make a plan, and that's really useful, because then I don't have to go through that all again and have all this insights. I've had the insights and I've put it into a plan, and so now I know I'm going to go there and I'm going to go there, and that's purely conceptual. And I can write it down if I feel like I need to. Is this complex enough to need to write it down? I can do that. Okay, so there's one more thing I want to throw in, and then I've got to quit because it's time for meditation. But let's talk a minute about reasoning and what that is. I wish I could ask you your perception because I'm curious about it. But anyway, all I can do is give you my own. So here's what it seems to me that reasoning is. So we have these ideas and concepts, right? We've abstracted from our experience and created ideas about things. And then there's a certain way that we have of putting those ideas and concepts together that we call reasoning. Well, what is that, and where does that come from? Well, to me, where it comes from is it's an internalization, it seems to me, of the way the world works. There's a certain way that physical reality operates. For example, one thing happens and then the next thing happens. They don't happen, there's a progression through time. Now, of course, it could be argued that that's just a human way of perceiving reality, and I think it probably is. And I did a podcast about time not long ago where, we have to question that whole thing. Like, is that actual reality, or is that just human perception? But anyway, at least within our experience of physical reality, things happen in time. And so that's been internalized inside our minds. And so our reasoning faculty goes from this to that through time. It's a linear process. The other obvious example is two different things cannot be in the same place at the same time. And that could be physical things, and that also can be abstractions. Like abstractions that contradict each other cannot be in the same place at the same time. That's a part of our reasoning faculty. Now, of course, our reasoning faculty is limited too, because we can step back. In that example, we can step back from our reasoning faculty and see, well, no, that's actually not so sometimes. It is possible for things that look contradictory to not be contradictory. Just, the reason they seem contradictory is because we don't have the big picture. We can't actually see how those are actually two aspects of the same thing. So there's a limitation in that capacity. But anyway, in general, it seems like, our reasoning, what that is it's an internalization. Like our minds have been constructed according to the same sort of principles and processes that the external world is constructed. And so when we take these ideas and concepts and we're manipulating them inside of our minds and comparing and contrasting, stringing them together and everything, because our minds are sort of a replica in miniature of the reality in the way that it is, the way we stick concepts together tends to mirror reality. And so, so I know that, if I beat the bushes, the rabbits are going to run into the net. That makes sense in my mind as well as in terms of outside reality. If the structures in my mind were different, then the stuff I would conclude would not match reality. And that's what happens in conditioned mind in this crazy way, that our reasoning faculty gets corrupted. And the structures that are there no longer represent reality. They represent these assumptions that we make about reality. And the conclusions we draw often have no relationship with reality at all. And so that's why we have to learn to observe our thinking processes. And we have to see the difference between a conditioned thinking process and a conscious thinking process, because the conditioned one is going to lead us to erroneous conclusions. Like, to use the prejudice example, people of a certain skin color are like this, and they're different than other people, or whatever it might be. It's like, well, that's not true, but the reasoning gets kind of corrupted, and it ends up taking us to places that are unhelpful and divorced from reality, and then cause us all to suffer. Okay, so I have to go, or else I'm going to be late for meditation. But so just to conclude, so what practice is to me is, this is just a part of it, is we're practicing the ability to be present and aware, and to be aware of our thinking capacity and our reasoning capacity, and to use those things consciously to serve our lives and to help us get our needs met, to help us have a good life on this earth. And as a part of that, we have to be able to see the difference between that and the conditioned thinking processes that actually pull us into all of the unhappy and suffering places that we experience as individuals and as our human family. And so at the foundation of that is to be aware, be present and aware, have our attention here. As I was saying before, being in the place of seeing instead of thinking. Because that's the place where practice, that's the opening in practice. It teaches us how to live in that place of just seeing. And then from the place of seeing, to conceptualize, to abstract when that's useful, and then to let that go when that's not useful. And awareness happens throughout all that process. And, whenever we have accomplished what we need to with our natural thinking capacity, to drop that and let that go and come back to a place of pure being and awareness and seeing. That, to me, I think, is what it's all about. Okay, thank you very much for listening. I have 2 minutes to make it to meditation. I'm going to leave you now, and good luck to you. Be well. Take care of yourself, and do good practice. Do good work out there.